I'm Roger Walsh, and my co-host is John Dupuy. And today we have a guest who I'm just delighted to have a chance to talk to because he has been tracing and creating the cultural edge of and observing various movements and issues, and has had a finger on the pulse of our culture for well over a decade. His name is Alexander Beiner, and he's played many roles. He's a committed contemplative and founded the meditation school in London, Open Meditation. He's been deeply involved in a variety of psychological growth and transformational practices, and himself is trained as a counselor. He's a group facilitator and leads groups online and in person in the UK and in Europe. He's also been a researcher of the psychedelic renaissance and is a director of the largest psychedelic conference in Europe, the Breaking Convention Conference. He's also been a kind of inspiration for our podcast because Alexander has been the co-host of the Rebel Wisdom podcast, which has been a pioneer initially in what was called the intellectual dark web. And then he appreciated the need for greater depth and coined the term the intellectual deep web. But he's also acknowledged that it needs to go beyond intellect in some of his most recent writings. And he has been someone who has, in his role as a host of Rebel Wisdom, has interviewed, dialogued with, and observed some of the emerging currents in our culture for well over a decade. He's also a writer. If you'd like to see some of his work, I recommend his articles on Medium. And he's really one of the people who I think of as someone with his finger on the cultural pulse. So I'm just delighted to have Alexander with us and to have someone who embodies the qualities we hope to bring to this podcast, which is contemplative depth and an awareness of and concern for the great issues of our time. So Alexander, or Ali as I know you like to be called, welcome. It's just a delight to have you with us.
Thank you, Roger. And yeah, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. And hi, John. Really glad to be with you guys. And yeah, really looking forward to this. I think we'll probably cover a lot of ground. Is my sense.
I assume so. So I mentioned a couple of times just how you have been on the edge, both a creator and observer of the cultural movements of the last decade. And with the internet, it feels like cultural evolution is accelerating in ways that probably leave us all spinning. And so I'd just love to step back and ask you to reflect on what you've observed over the last decade or more. And what are some of the things that, for example, have most stood out for you and perhaps most surprised you?
Yes, what a great question. I'll zoom out a little bit, and I actually think you mentioned the internet, and that's maybe a nice anchor point to look at the trajectory of the internet. I think people in my generation, so I'm 34, so I'm probably the last couple of years of people who can remember a time without the internet. And looking things up in encyclopedias. And then at about age 8 or 9, it went from Encyclopedia Britannica, like all the different volumes that you'd have on a bookshelf, to the encyclopedia on the CD-ROM. And I remember that really vividly, actually. And then, of course, the evolution of the internet as a at first novelty, and then increasingly somewhere we're spending almost as much time as we are in what some call real life, although of course if you read a lot of science fiction literature, there's that blending of the two worlds is often a theme, and I think something that we're living through. So I often think about the history of the internet as a useful way to track how culture has changed, and I'm always struck by the optimism that there was in the early internet, and also quite a strong spiritual sensibility with a lot of the people who were involved in that, and a sense that, you know, some people saw, like, you know, Terence McKenna and Timothy Leary, I think, specifically looked at it as a kind of like Gaian mind, like this kind of earth mind that would bind us all together and help us to come together, you know, and share ideas, which, you know, it's a complex place. It certainly does that. And I think maybe the peak of that, well, yes, perhaps the peak, I'm sure lots of people would have a different answer to this, but it was the Arab Spring, and this sense of the internet being a part of democratizing the world as well. And then partly, I think, because of the way the technology evolved and the influence of the market primarily, the internet started becoming a much darker place, and a place that, while it certainly has connected us and completely changed our lives, has also really become the a kind of collective unconscious, in, you know, a kind of place where all of our darkest aspects go to have kind of unbridled freedom, and a place that, you know, we've covered this on Rebel Wisdom a lot, where the technology of the social media platforms, for example, is on a trajectory of what Tristan Harris calls a kind of a race to the bottom of the brainstem. So specifically designed to be addictive and to maximize time on the platform, which often is about maximizing how outraged people feel. And so this kind of cultural polarization, I think, I don't think is caused by the internet, but I think it's certainly been made much worse by it. And so now in 2021, I've described it as a kind of, it often feels like we're in a noir detective story in some way, because we are encountering this. I think a lot of people have a sense of being culturally adrift, and also a sense that so many of the institutions that we used to trust to make sense of the world are captured in some way, usually captured by market forces, captured by really bad incentive structures, whether that's academia or the medical institution, or the, you know, big pharma, even a lot of our religious institutions. There's this real lack of trust, a kind of a crisis of trust in institutions, and then part of what that creates is a kind of wild west of, well, where do we get truth from? And online, there's a ferocious narrative war raging, and it's a multipolar war, not between so there's many different actors. There's an article called The Internet of Beefs by a guy called Venkatesh Rao, who really lays out this dynamic very well, where you have lots of people with an audience, and they're incentivized to have their followers kind of engage in war with one another. And that, you know, they can monetize that because they get more clicks, they get more engagement. And that is happening at such an alarming and intense rate that for those of us just going online to say, figure out, well, what's the best climate science out there? What, you know, I want to make up my mind about what's going on environmentally, and what's the best, you know, probably to find the best course of action. Or I want to figure out, okay, well, what's really the science around vaccines, or I want to figure out really anything anything at all. We are almost immediately entering into a kind of narrative war. And so a lot of what we've been focused on in Rebel Wisdom is, well, how do we use the some of the techniques and attitudes that have come from the wisdom traditions and the personal growth worlds to make that a little bit easier. To be able to decenter, take a step back, and have some discernment over what's going on and what information we're absorbing, you know, aware of our own emotional reactions, and then figuring out how to come into a new kind of dialogue with each other around really difficult ideas. And so that's no easy task. It's a very, very, very difficult one. And we don't claim to have the answer to it, but I do think there's a great role for different practices that have been around for thousands of years in helping us do that.
Yeah, beautiful. Boy, you said so much there. First, you pointed out the enormous optimism that arose with this new technology, the web. And there was Peter Russell's book, The Global Brain, and a whole slew of ideas that this was going to bring humanity together at last. And of course, what most people forgot, and I think Ken Wilber was a notable exception, was that it was just a medium, and you can run multiple levels of consciousness through that same medium and amplify them depending on the audience they get. And as you pointed out, painfully, Tristan's idea of the race to the bottom of the brainstem, that there are there are incentives and forces and something in the inherent nature of the web as it's currently constituted that leads to a kind of lowest common denominator. And I love what you said, that you're now engaged in a process of discovering how to alleviate some of that. And I love you to expand on that, because that just feels like such
let me say something that really moved me from Rebel Wisdom. There was recently, and maybe it's ongoing, this kerfluffle of this conflict with Eric Weinstein and the ivermectin thing. And
Brett, his brother Brett.
I knew I was going to get the wrong brother.
No,
anyway, sorry, Eric. And I saw how David really struggled with that. You know, I thought he had so much integrity. And this man was a friend, you know, he's also really respected his brother's work. And he was, you know, going out, starting a new thing and he didn't want to do it. You know, it was something he was drawn into, but his integrity felt he had, because he thought he was putting out information that was really harmful in a time of plague, if you will. And that was one of the more moving things that I can remember on the internet in a long time, just seeing that struggle and witness that. And how he, you know, used all his tools and took him right to the edge of his own, you know, of his own self in order to ascertain the truth with a big T. And, you know, it was good. And I appreciate you guys so much for kind of leading the way in that struggle that that we're all engaged in, who are engaged in the internet right now.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you know, that was really David's kind of very personal and difficult struggle with, and I think he did tremendously well with it. Definitely, it actually leads quite nicely into to Roger's question, in the sense that, so, you know, when there's an argument over a proposition, right? This proposition of are the vaccines safe, and in that case, is ivermectin a better alternative? We get it's very difficult not to get caught in the propositional realm of, okay, well, let's look at the evidence. You kind of have to do that, right? You kind of got to look at the evidence and try and wrestle with that and try and find the good signal in all the noise, and have the kind of critical capacity and discernment. But beneath all that is all these other, and I'm using a frame now from John Vervaeke, his 4 ways of knowing. There's also this kind of, there's other ways of, well, actually, I'll put a flag in that, because it'll take a while to get into that more, is that is the concept of our motivated reasoning, which is something I started investigating more when this was when that story was ongoing, which is that it seems that there's a kind of myth that we make decisions about things like this as purely rational agents. But I think a lot of the neuroscience is pointing towards the fact that our reasoning is motivated by our desires and our emotions. And so that's a great example, I think, of where it looks like we're talking about propositions. Does this work? Is this safe? But actually, we're talking about a huge realm of emotional and, you know, arguably spiritual reality that's going on at the same time. There's so many different forces at play. And I think it often gets stuck in the propositional, and then the conversation kind of breaks down, which I think, unfortunately, was a place it was difficult to get beyond. In that particular example, it was difficult to get beyond the propositional. But and this points as well to something Roger mentioned in the introduction, which was the necessity to go beyond just the intellectual, you know, as we might define it. And that's where the practices, I think, come in. Because, for example, if we are feeling a deep degree of certainty around something for which we don't have, or we're seeing the evidence as absolutely certain, then I think that's a warning sign usually to go, okay, well, is anything ever that certain? I'm not a scientist, so where is my own desire and my own needs and my own emotional needs getting met by this certainty? And that's the kind of process they don't teach in university very often, where we're like the process of really looking within and asking where my entire frame of reference is perhaps wonky. And this is, again, John Vervaeke's work. If anyone hasn't checked it out, is well worth checking out. But he has this very nice metaphor, which is very simple, but I found it really useful, of the contemplative, of different practices being like meditation, for example, being like taking off your glasses and looking at your frame, because you're seeing through your glasses, so you're seeing through your frame, and that's coloring how you see the entire world. And with a practice like meditation, we can take a step back and look at the frame and say, okay, that's where it's dirty, and I can kind of clean it. and then once we've done that, John argues, like, well, do we want to necessarily stay just staring at our glasses forever? Well, maybe if we were living in a monastery, perhaps that is the choice we make, and more power to us. That's great. But very often, if we're engaged in the world, we have to then put our glasses back on and then engage with others and get into a process of kind of dialogue and testing. Okay, well, am I seeing more clearly now? Is my view on reality being met by other people's view? Is my life changing? Am I changing? Do I feel like I understand more? Do I feel more connected to reality, to myself, to the universe? And so that process of zooming out and zooming in continuously, like breath, I suppose, is I think one of the great gifts of practices like meditation, and a practice I use a lot comes from the Ridwan tradition, or diamond essence. I have a few different names, of inquiry, kind of talking meditation. Mm-hmm. And those practices are ones we use a lot in Rebel Wisdom. In our, we have an online course called Sensemaking 101, and people often join it, I think, expecting to be looking at different news articles and kind of having discussions on the propositional level. And while we do that, we mainly spend the first half of it focusing on presence. In fact, John Vervaeke has a session on wisdom. We have Diane Michaud Hamilton talking about relating. And then once we've done that process, and people have been working in pods together, inquiring and getting better at being curious about their own feelings, really listening to other people, then we introduce okay, well, let's try and make sense of this news article or this cultural phenomena. Because if we jump this, my sense when designing the course was there's almost, not no point, but I think it's a real wasted opportunity. And it feels like I feel much more in integrity with saying, okay, well, the best I can offer from what I've learned and what our incredible faculty have to offer is that until we've developed those skills of zooming in and zooming out, like obviously keep developing them, but if we get some basic, we can just start riding the bike with it, then we can apply them to making sense of the outside. So moving from the inside to the outside. And that, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. And you're bringing in now one of the values of the contemplative practices, that they actually provide ways of, as you call it, stepping back, or in technical term would call it moving to a meta perspective, a perspective in which you can look at your previous perspective, and also cultivating what I call perspectival fluidity, the capacity to move from one perspective to another and see. And as you implied, most of our lives we live locked into one particular perspective, not even suspecting that other perspectives may be equally valid and illuminating, or different lenses, and provide different contexts. So what I hear you saying is that if we are to approach both the issues of our time, and particularly the challenges of meaning making that the current information warfare almost on the internet faces us with, then we are required to bring to become more, to cultivate our capacities for taking perspectives, for stepping out of our motivated reasoning. And only then, I love what you're doing, because you're basically honing the instruments of knowing in people, so that then the investigation of what's so can be a little less emotional, a little broader, a little more of a meta perspective. It just sounds a very valuable approach.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. I really love that phrase, the perspectival fluidity. I think if there was um, one quality that I want to develop in myself more always, and would want people to be developing if they're interested in making sense, it's that fluidity, because I think so much of the issue is that stuckness in, often ideological perspective. And another thing came up for me as you were describing that, which is this tension that we always, since the beginning of Rebel Wisdom, have been trying to balance, which is actually kind of hidden in the name. The rebel side is in a sense the kind of cultural, political side, and the wisdom side is the wisdom side, their wisdom traditions. And the combination of the two, I notice we have at different times swung more into, say, delving right into the cultural stuff, but then there's a feeling of getting trapped there. There's this real sense of like, oh God, we're going to spend all of our time arguing with people, or trying not to argue with people, or getting into some kind of
Right.
completely wrapped up. And so, okay, well, if we zoom out into that meta perspective, okay, we get some breathing space. And then at the same time, if we stay in the meta perspective too long, it feels like we start to lose the sense of being tapped into the culture. And so this continuous process of trying to find the ever moving sweet spot between being meta enough and zoomed in enough. And I mean, we I don't know if we ever have reached some magical sweet spot. I think we're always penduluming, and the hope is that the pendulum swings a little bit less, or is a little bit more, a bit fluid. And I think that's a wider it's a wider phenomena I've noticed as well, which is that people in the spiritual traditions and the personal growth worlds very often, I think, have a reluctance to go too much into the cultural political stuff. And likewise, people in that world, the cultural political world, are reluctant to go too far into the meta and the spiritual. And so the bringing together of those two worlds feels very important. And, for example, Jamie Bristow, who runs the mindfulness initiative in the UK, people might be familiar with. He's been doing interesting work in that area, teaching, or helping facilitate different groups teaching meditation to politicians. And he's become increasingly interested in the ideas of people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall, who we've featured on Rebel Wisdom, who I would say are the kind of quintessential, or some of the quintessential intellectual deep web characters, who are bringing that more meta perspective. And yet it's a tricky one, because I notice in a lot of the online communities centered around these ideas, there is a tendency there's definitely a leaning towards meta rather than zooming in. I've noticed in lots of the different ones, and I think that makes sense. But there's a potential danger. I think I've noticed it in myself as well. There's a potential danger of using meta as a kind of bypass, and so I think a lot of us are familiar with the idea of spiritual bypassing. And I play with the idea of like meta bypassing, or in some instances future bypassing, where people are very focused on how do we make a better world, and then become very fixated on that, rather than focusing on the realities of what's happening right now, which is, I think, something humans tend to do with our utopias, for example. So that's just an open inquiry. I feel like I'm always on, and attention that I'm feeling in this space quite often. Yeah.
That's so beautiful, Ali. I'm really moved and inspired by it, because what I hear you talking about is, and doesn't have to be put in a spiritual framework, but like a spiritual politics or social concern and activity as a contemplative practice, and bringing those two worlds together, and so that one's work in the world becomes a the work in the world itself becomes a practice. You talk about zooming out, zooming in, etc. And I think of there's a venerable idea that the historian Arnold Toynbee spoke of, that he found, well, the one characteristic of the people that had most impact on human history was that they had in their lives displayed what he called the cycle withdrawal and return. That at a certain stage in their life, they withdrew from the busyness of society. They dove deep into themselves to look at the fundamental questions of life. They had some kind of illumination, and then they brought that illumination back to help and heal and teach. And so that cycle withdrawal and return, which is what I think you're alluding to in a way, feels so crucial. It's like we go into ourselves in order to go deeper and more effectively out into the world, and we go out into the world in order to go deeper into ourselves. And it's that way, it's a mutually facilitating cycle. And I just really resonate with what you're saying there.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I like that. I like that a lot. The especially, I don't think I'd quite consider the kind of going out into the world in order, the other side of the equation that you mentioned right at the end, going out in order to connect more with ourselves. That's a really beautiful side of the equation. I think there's often, I think I often miss out actually thinking about it. And I also had this image as you were talking of, famously like the UK Parliament, the setup they have where there's both sides of the house and then this little bit down on the ground in the middle, and they stand up, and it's quite raucous and like odd and kind of archaic. But I have this image of instead of that, you would have a kind of group process. Like I've done a lot of group processes, like the Path of Love, for example, is one run by the people who trained me as a counselor, and just the depth of authenticity that comes out of a process like that, a kind of deep spiritual psychotherapeutic process, and making that an active political decision making or political processing would be fascinating. Just imagining flipping those two worlds around. So instead of that raucous back and forth, I would love to just see one of them be like, okay, well, what's really coming up for you as you say that? Just kind of interrupt the performance. Yeah,
exactly. And it is possible. I had the privilege quite some years ago now being in a group mediated by the great psychologist, probably actually often described as the greatest psychologist of the 20th century, Carl Rogers. And
wow.
he had enough power to convene a group of Central American politicians, high level, like vice presidents, ambassadors, etc., and to run a group with them for 4 days. And wow. I got to have the privilege of sitting in on this. And first day I was there people standing up and lecturing at one another. And by the end of it, also with having meals and beer and wine together, it really became a much more interpersonally generous and heartfelt community, such as you described. So it is possible. Not many people
that's
have
incredible.
not many people have the cachet of Carl Rogers to pull a group like that together, but it's nice to know it's possible.
Yeah, I had no idea that it happened. And my counseling training was very Rogerian, basically, and so that's incredible to hear. I would God, did they document that in any way? Did anyone write anything of it?
It's been written up, yes. I think in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. I'll see if I can find you an article.
And thank you. That'd be fascinating to see what his take on that was. And yeah, excellent. Yeah, amazing.
So your vision has at least once, been instantiated.
That's fabulous. And and I think it is. I think there's a possibility for it. I don't think anyone would have thought that the mindfulness initiative would have managed to get MPs in the parliament meditating, and I think they've done 10 or 15 parliaments around the world now. It's like, okay, yeah, that there's an openness. And then the next, the other big factor coming in now to culture is the psychedelic renaissance, and I'm curious to see what that will do, especially if politicians start having well-held psychedelic experiences, which remains to be seen, but that could be another interesting tool. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
do you, sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I've been really listening to you a lot for the last couple of weeks, getting ready for this, and so it's been a real grace. And that's one of the things you impressed me is your take on psychedelics. You seem to have a very clear-eyed view based on those who came before you and all the mistakes and all the progress that we've made over the last 40 or 50 years, and the idea of seeking truth, but beyond truth, wisdom, and the idea of contemplative practice. And I'm sure Ken Wilber's idea of integral practice. So given, the times that we live in, and by the way, I was listening to a talk you gave in 2019, you were talking to David, it felt so dated. So much has happened in 2 bloody years. It's just like, it was all good stuff, nothing to be denied, but it just felt really dated. But what does it look like in your life right now? What is, how do you bring this together? How do you bring practice, contemplative practice, your internet, the working with people, and psychedelics, and how do they play into this? And so, and I know in my case, my practice keeps evolving as I change, I age, my exercise routines, all that's a bit different, but what are you kind of sensing into, if you could recommend kind of a meta practice for most people to do, what would it entail at this point?
Ooh, interesting question. So I'm actually on a bit of a journey with this at the moment. So in terms of my own meditation practice and trying to be in a space of non-striving with it. And I notice my practice goes through very big waves and back and forth, which I suppose is true of all of us, and a natural thing. But I certainly, again, to mention Vervaeke, because he's been very influential in my thinking around topics like this, is he talks about having an ecology of practices, which I think took me, I had a sense for a long time that, and I had a confusion, honestly, around, well, what practice should I be doing most, and when should I be doing them, and when should I be doing concentration meditation, and when is it better to do mindfulness, and go on to all sorts of a tizzy with that kind of thing. And I feel like I'm trying to find my own ecology of practices as well. I like to play with things. I like to kind of combine things and see where they work, and I've always been interested in and very excited about when people are doing that and kind of sharing notes on that. One practice that I found useful in the last couple of years is just combining concentration meditation. I developed something called the sovereignty meditation for the online course, which was just a combination of different of breath work. So Wim Hof style fast breath work, which I found makes it much easier to meditate afterwards. So breath work, and then concentration meditation, and then zooming in, I guess, and then zooming out into mindfulness, and then ending with inquiry, either through journaling if someone's by themselves, or having a partner to inquire with. And that was really just a kind of a combination of practices that I found particularly useful over my life, I guess, and putting them into a format, mainly also for the course to show people, hey, these are different types of meditation. These are different types of practice, and if you do them together, it's easier to notice that they're different. And the order is what I experimented on my with friends and my wife in particular, just asking them if they would please okay, now try it with the breathing third. just kind of did it over a few months. So that's something that I still find useful. I think one of the great gifts that for me over the last few years has really been the inquiry aspect of it, though. This kind of and the whole essence work that goes along with it, with the core idea being that we have a true essential self, and that our personality structure is built up around a us adapting to survive in the environment we grow up in, but isn't necessarily us. It's at least out of date, and then coming back into an essence. And there's something around speaking, a speaking meditation and following threads and staying curious that is just sort of magic. It's just magic. It's actually what our whole counseling training was based off of, was kind of inquiry based counseling. So it's quite very kind of Rogerian in that sense, very kind of non-interventionist. So I find and journaling, I think, is an example of that. Now, in terms of like the edge of where my interests lie, I'm also very interested in what, as a psychedelic renaissance expands, perhaps too fast for its own good, in my view, but that we can perhaps get onto that in a bit. But as it expands, there is very little out there yet of what it looks like to combine different modalities together. And that really fascinates me. For example, the somatic experiencing world and the psychedelic world, or for example, meditation and psychedelics is one that's more established, one I've been interested in for a long time. But there's just so many different, the family constellations work and MDMA, for example. So there's a real, I think, opportunity for researchers and skilled practitioners to be exploring what is going to help people and what's going to be the most enriching and connecting practices to bring alongside psychedelics, because there's this different school of thought around like how psychedelics work, but many people would argue, I think most people would argue, that the practices and the context and the kind of process you do alongside them is more important than the actual drug itself. I would, and there's a spectrum of where people sit. Some people think the drug itself is therapeutic by itself, with like, even if you don't have as much intervention. I think there's truth to that, but certainly we don't really know that much. After, we really don't have that great an idea of what the potentials are for the rituals. I would call them rituals. The rituals and processes we use alongside them. So I'm really interested in that, and that feels like a real new frontier on the horizon.
I've determined to later on this fall, I'm going to do a guided psilocybin experience, and I haven't done it in 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And it's something that and Roger's work with it, and his writing, and the interviews of all the, the first generation of pioneers, Hoffman and Groff and all of these guys. But a very, very, very powerful formative experience. But I went into practice, and I dedicated the last 20 years to more meditation and stuff. But I feel a rising in the zeitgeist that they're back, and that I think it's important for me to be in integrity in the time that I live in, that I have to go back. And I've never done a guided one. It's usually out on a canyon, out in the wilderness alone, someplace, usually at night. And that's where I did it. But I think I'll do it, a guided experience. I have a friend, and he lives in that area where it's legal now.
Yeah.
And try that one. And
beautiful.
But I found my experience was a practice. If you do the psychedelic experience without practice, you're really wasting it somehow, because you don't ground it, you don't establish it, you don't keep that opening open. And if you just do the practice without the psychedelic experience, well, you're missing a huge boost that can get you there quicker.
Definitely. Well, I hope you have a really good and welcome back to that world, a good kind of re-entry into it. That's exciting. And just before I forget, actually, that's one of the things that I think really could be combined very well with the psychedelic experience is inquiry specifically. And I did that a year or so ago with someone sitting for me, and it happened quite spontaneously, where I felt, I think it started with a twinge and a feeling I had in my shoulder. And I thought, I'm gonna inquire into this, and I just said out loud, I think it started with, I'm noticing a kind of movement in my shoulder right now. I'm not, I'm kind of curious what it is, and then it would move somewhere else, and then it went on for about 2 hours of just speaking, and there was a real synergy of speaking to the experience, deepened the experience, and it became one of the most profound experiences I had. And that's I think a cool example, because in psychedelic therapy, that's not usually the way it's done. It's very non-interventionalist, and there is psycholytic therapy, which is more kind of a talking therapy, but I haven't yet seen people use that modality with, and I'm not sure it would be appropriate necessarily for everyone, but that's the kind of thing I think that is very exciting, because it could well take us to to deeper places of insight.
Yeah. And you're really pointing to some of the contemplative and therapeutic questions of our time. You mentioned, you began by talking about the enormous variety of practices and techniques we have available to us, which is quite novel in human history. And so we have this cornucopia of practices, and one of the great questions, there are questions both personal and research levels. At the personal level, what combination works best and how do I discover it? And I remember years ago, Ram Dass talking about there's a developmental process. He said at first, when you first open into the contemplative world, it's good to fine to take a smorgasbord approach. I'll try some of this, I'll try some of that. But then after a certain period of time, you may find what really resonates for you. And so you dive deeper. And then perhaps years later, you'll be wanting to experiment with different things, try different things. So there is a kind of a wisdom of how to proceed and explore with these. And at the research level, we've got a century of research ahead of us trying to determine what practices work best for what people at what stages of their life and under what circumstances. And now specifically, as you point out, with the psychedelic renaissance, these curious chemicals back re-emerging into society, not completely delegitimized yet or legitimized yet, but it's approaching that way. But traditionally, the use of these substances was done in a sacred context. And we didn't have that. When they hit in the 60s, it was like they emerged into a culture utterly unprepared for them, with no understanding of how to use them skillfully, and a group of pioneers did quickly begin to learn, but we're still learning how best to use them. And as to their role in a spiritual life, some years ago I did a research study in interviewing people who were spiritual teachers who'd had awakenings through their practice, but also had them through psychedelics. And there was a unanimity among them, which was interesting. They all agreed that, yes, for the right person, and there's some people who should never use these chemicals, but for the right person, these can be helpful as long as they're part of a practice. They're not a path unto themselves, but they can facilitate and catalyze a practice, as both you and John suggested. So, yeah, this is an emerging area.
Yeah, that's that brings me a bit on to another thing that I'm really interested in at the moment, which is so psychedelics are coming. Okay, actually, to start back, you talked about those pioneers who for 30 years in some cases. Now, Rick Doblin has been who runs Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, who are very close to getting MDMA legalized as a medicine. He's been working on that since 1986, and I was born in 1987. So I'm always just in awe of just the sheer willpower and process that so many of the pioneers went through to get us to where we are now, and yet we're facing something kind of unprecedented now, which is that in some ways it's scarier for the mainstream to accept the psychedelics than to reject them, like happened in the 60s. And by that I mean, we don't, like you said, Roger, like psychedelics have traditionally been done with a fairly strong cultural container, and a kind of a sense of they're embedded into a much, much deeper, richer process of kind of cultural values and norms and rituals and symbols. And what's happened now is that there isn't really a sense of a cohesive psychedelic culture. So the argument was, and I was really a big proponent of this as well, that psychedelics would best be brought into the mainstream through the biomedical route, because that would be the most palatable, and there is a need for more effective mental health treatments. But I think what happened in the process is that many of us forgot that because of the nature of psychedelics, if you're going to put them inside a Trojan horse and wheel that Trojan horse up to the gates of mainstream culture, you have to think about the horse as much as you think about what's inside the horse. So you have to think about
great
the
metaphor.
practices. So, and it's that is, and I think now we're realizing as the main proponents and the main steam behind the Renaissance starts to move from the researchers and the activists towards the venture capitalists and the pharma companies.
Mm-hmm.
Many of us are realizing, oh dear. So
Yeah.
I've become particularly interested in what it looks like over the next 5-10 years to consciously build a psychedelic metaculture that it will involve everyone. I think it'll involve everyone creating a container for that and then allowing it to emerge, because culture sort of emerges through various different forms. But right now we're not, there's a real lack of certainty as to what is a psychedelic value. Like, what should the values be that are surrounding these substances and the practices around them? And that is at the moment quite unclear. So I'm working on a big new project called the Psychedelic Value Survey, which is using a few different measures of values and moral foundations and spiritual belief, and then a lot of qualitative questions to try and see, well, is there anything that links? That's a real open question for me. I'm not sure that there might not be, but try and kind of look at what are the different tribes and value systems at play at the same time. So it'll be very different for someone who feels very connected to, say, the Santo Daime tradition, right? Which is a kind of ayahuasca church, compared to someone who is very involved in the counterculture and likes to go to Burning Man. And yet both of those people might say that psychedelics and psychedelic practices have had a significant impact on their lives. And so, that's my curiosity is, mapping that out and then creating a conversation around, okay, how can we start to build the horse around, or make that Trojan horse sustainable and inclusive enough that it includes indigenous people, for so many of whom have brought the wisdom of how to, and in many cases the substances, the medicines themselves, and the countercultural voices, and of course the research and the pharma and the venture capitalist voices, not to exclude anyone in particular, but to create a healthy narrative and mimetic ecosystem around them. And that's something I'm really hoping that the community as it stands, if you can call it a community, if it's so disparate, but the people who really care about psychedelics changing culture rather than being changed by culture, we can all start to make some art together, in a sense, start kind of building culture and playing with that.
May it be so. And I was struck by a painful analogy as you described your concern about the way in which this psychedelic renaissance is emerging with surprising speed. And one of the issues you pointed to was the intense interest now, economic interest of the pharmaceutical companies and venture capitalists, and how can we make a buck out of this? And it just starts to sound very familiar to the web. And the early optimism, and wow, and it's like, wow, so much of that got captured. It's a painful thought to think of these what have for perhaps tens of thousands of years been profound spiritual tools and catalysts and openers and entheogens, an opening to the God within, to think of those being subverted by economic forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and it's sort of haunted me for the last year or so. I've been covering I actually put a film out called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism. This I've really been covering this and wrestling with it, like properly wrestling with it, because I recognize the importance as well of some of that model, of, and there the arguments that a lot of the pharma companies make of like this is the way to get to for people to access it. I understand that argument, and at the same time, well, the question is at what cost? There's actually some short stories by a sci-fi writer called Norman Spinrad, and they're very, very obscure. I don't know how many I know of them because I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on psychedelic literature, and that was one of the only things really out there. There's not that much. There's the famous ones, I think the Huxleys of the world, etc. And so that they were present, but it he in I think 1971 it might have been, he was writing short stories where one of them is two men in a lab who are making designer psychedelics for capitalist culture, and it was incredibly before his time. He was already worried about that, and I think there was certainly a recognition already early on that that's a possibility. And my big concern with that is that, like has happened with the commodification of mindfulness and yoga as well. You always get deep, authentic practice at the same time as practice that's designed, I think, more to maintain the status quo than it is to help people step back from it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a point a woman called Kat Kanor, who set up an ethics pledge called the North Star Pledge, or helped set up. She made the point, I think, really well of like, that helped me in my thinking. My thinking was a bit black and white around. It's like, there's going to be everything. There's going to be deep, very well held processes, and there's going to be probably badly held ones, and there's going to be people trying to cut corners with psychedelic clinics and go from, okay, well, maybe 3 integration sessions is too much, well, maybe they could just do 1 and maybe it could be over Zoom. That kind of race to the bottom, I think will probably also happen. And so but I think that again it was why it's important for people to start the conversation around, well, what do we want these substances to bring beyond just to be mental health treatments? Because even that, they're not magic pills, and it's the therapy and the holding in the container around people that is really seems to be making them get better or have better outcomes with depression, for example. So it's a really complex thing. And also there's another question of access. Is it going to be only people with enough money? Because it's quite expensive. There's quite a lot of therapist time involved. There's a lot of different factors. Is it only going to be accessible to people who can already now, say, afford weekly psychotherapy, which is sort of the middle class and upper middle class? That would also be a great tragedy, So, but there's lots of good things happening as well. In for example, Oregon, the model that they've developed there, I think, is really, really exciting, where instead of it being where it's legalized, and the Oregon state kind of health body will be in charge of that, and therapists can, in private practice, be administering. So that is a much more democratized version of it. So all of these different models are kind of happening at the same time. It's just that we're seeing a kind of turf war as to who's got the epistemic authority to decide what psychedelics are for and who they're for. So it's an interesting time, certainly.
Well, in these mushrooms in Oregon, especially in many places in North America, they pop out of the ground all over the place.
Yeah.
It's hard to control it too much when these crazy entities just bloop, bloop, there they are, kids,
Yeah, they are prolific. Yeah, it's something wonderful about that, isn't it? There's a kind of trickster element to them. Yeah.
And what you said was very helpful for me, because I realized as you were talking and speaking to the plethora of different forms and institutional and approaches that are emerging and doubtless will emerge. And it made me realize I had my purism of the one right way is. I don't think that's going to survive long.
Yeah, I feel I've that a lot myself as well. It's the place I kind of go back to. I have some vague sense of how I think it should be and how I'd like it to be, but it is in a way very psychedelic. It's multifaceted and it's kind of unpredictable and it's moving in lots of different directions. So yeah.
Have you seen any churches or religious organizations embracing psychedelics in this new renaissance?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there are some. There's some smaller ones, and then also there's some much more established ones like the Native American Church, and peyote. Sorry, or yeah, peyote specifically. And then there's a lot of ayahuasca traditions, and
That's
Sato
right.
Daime being the biggest one. So they're already they're established. But an interesting question is which ones emerge. And one of the arguments that gets less airtime is the one around religious freedom. But part of the issue, and something that I'm curious to ask about in the survey, is a lot of people, I think, who use psychedelics as tools for spiritual insight or personal growth would consider themselves spiritual but not religious, and probably have a reluctance to decide to kind of say that they were religious in any sense, or join a kind of religion. And there's a lot of baggage around that, for good reason. But I think it does then make it quite difficult in the current legal system and the current cultural system to say this is for religious use. I haven't seen much success in people claiming religious use, and some have been successful, but I think the state looks at it and they're like, well, no, you're just 10 people who meet regularly. It's not a religion, is it? And so that's an interesting kind of tension present, because I think religious use is incredibly important, because what it does is, because I think that's the use I connect to the most, and I think it's very healthy to have psychotherapeutic and therapeutic use alongside religious use, because and the big question for me is, how can we create a healthy ecosystem where if someone wants to have an experience because they, to alleviate their suffering, say, where there's a lot of power questions at play, because right now it would be a psychiatrist who would kind of bring them into a particular model of, okay, well, this is how we're going to treat you. But there's also an equal right to say that they could go to their rabbi and say, or their priest or whoever it might be, and go, I know that they might have a completely different take on it. They'd be like, look, this is a spiritual malady, and they need to maybe they need to connect with God more deeply. Maybe they need to come into right relationship with themselves, or and so there's all these different approaches, and this is something I'm fascinated by, like, who decides what sickness is, who's sick, what kind of treatment they should get, and it's going to I think it'll take a while to work out. It's going to be a big conversation.
I think we can agree on that.
Yeah.
Yes, certainly in my life, it's been going on my lifetime, so I don't expect it to end within my lifetime.
Yeah.
There's so much we could. Well, there's a topic I'd love to go back to, but before I nudge us there, let me ask if there's anything else around this fascinating topic you'd like to speak to.
No, I'm good. I think I've covered what's feels salient to me. So yeah.
Okay, great. Well, one of the topics you mentioned, I mean, there have been so many, and we won't get through them all in this conversation, but we can have fun trying. And one of the interfaces you mentioned, and which you're exploring and have been observing, is this interface between the contemplative and the cultural, the spiritual and the political. And you talked about that, and I'm intrigued by the idea of how we use this as part of our practice. And we spoke about, the going in order to go out more effectively out, and going out to go deeper in. But it seems to me that there is a practice for this, and it's the Hindu practice. There are 4 major yogas, but one of them is karma yoga, the yoga of using one's work and action in the world as one's practice. And it seems that this may be an ideal approach for us to at least be aware of as we engage with the world. And the traditional elements of karma yoga, just to lay it out briefly, were to that one, well, before beginning anything, one set an intention for the highest good of all. Second, one offered the activity to traditionally God, but it can be to any larger, something larger than any transpersonal ideal. Third thing, one did one's activity in the world, one's action, one's work, one's politics as impeccably as you possibly could. And the fourth step was the real kicker, which makes it into such a knife edge practice. One does one's work as impeccably as possible while simultaneously attempting to let go any egoic attachment to the outcome. And it's that last step which rips away the attachment, the egocentricity about how am I doing, how's this look, it's going to turn out the way I want, etc., and turns it actually into a cathartic process of releasing any egoic involvement and attachment and aversion and pride, etc. And it seems to me that of all the practices we have, that's the one that seems most appropriate to this work, to the spiritual social activism, and to the issues of our time, where most of us aren't, monastics. Most of us are trying to practice and bring our practice into the world, and this is the one which seems like it can enable our practice to be a full-time process, which all the traditions emphasize the importance of continuity. So here's a way in which our practice can be continuous, and we can live and love with our families and help and heal and contribute in whatever ways we can. So love to have your comments.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very, I feel quite inspired by that because of especially the last bit, that the kind of letting go, and the beauty in that. And what strikes me as we haven't talked so much about the concept of this sort of meaning crisis, or this kind of lack of a sense of coherence in culture, which I think is one of the big things that we're trying to make sense of now. Because I think it was the second step of committing to something higher than ourselves, that we don't have as much of a cultural framework for doing that as we did, say, when Christianity was a bigger force in this part of the world. Or I remember listening to the Ranulph Fiennes, the explorer, talking one time about the absolute necessity to have something higher than yourself when you're out exploring in the wilderness. And his was the memory of his father and his grandfather, who had both been explorers. So that's a kind of ancestral one, which is very powerful as well. But I think there's a real need culturally for a sense of commitment to something higher. I think we're in this space where, and Ken Wilber speaks to this really well, going through modernism to postmodernism. And in modernism, it was emerging after, say, the kind of horrors of the First World War, where we did have a big meta narrative that it was like, yeah, you can die for your country. Like, that's something that is a higher, that we're living for and serving for, and it's higher than us. And then that became something that we didn't, for good reason, that we started becoming suspicious of. And then with the decline of organized religion, we're in this kind of, as Nietzsche said, kind of the death of God. We're in this kind of void, in a sense. And then we start making religion out of anything we can find. And that's a dangerous place to be, I think, because what I think the wisdom traditions are, one of the reasons they're so important, is that this sense of what you surrender to, feels to me very, very important. Because if I'm surrendering, and it has to be divine. I think it has to be big enough to contain everything, rather than surrendering to, say, an ideology. And that sense of the divine, and like the role of the sacred and the divine in culture, for me, that's the thing that's missing right now, is a sense of divinity. And I think once we have that, then that ability to surrender, that kind of first step, everything kind of falls into place for me in that whole process, that whole yoga you were describing. Everything falls into place when we can surrender to something higher. And I think it's not that thing has gone away, because I think it's ever present. And I think a lot of people are doing that in different traditions and different and in our own lives and our relationships with the divine. So I don't think it's not there. It's just that it's not culturally something that we have a space for. The churches are kind of going empty, and they're being converted into, in one case in Dublin, a nightclub, which is, it's like there's a big church that's now a nightclub. And so that, and I'm not suggesting necessarily like a kind of Christian revival by any means. I'm suggesting like a revival of the place it had in culture, and what that looks like, who knows. I've argued that that we're right now seeing a nascent expression of that. I've called it the age of breach, where we have these sort of proto religions forming online, and they're very chaotic, and they're a lot of them very fear-based, like QAnon, and they people are getting into these very mythic ways of seeing the world, and then is breaching out into the real world, like in the Capitol riots, for example, or GameStop. In the Capitol riots, the look of perplexed wonder on the faces of some of the people is almost like they've woken up from a dream, and they're like, oh, I've gone from the internet and this kind of whipped up frenzy into standing in the seat of democracy. And they're surprised. They can't quite believe they're there. And then the GameStop phenomena that happened, where lots of just regular people were taking on Wall Street with betting on a completely useless stock a few months ago. That was hilarious and amazing, and a real Robin Hood kind of moment, which I think was very satisfying. But spending a bit of time on Reddit and the threads, there was something also a little bit magical going on. There was a sense of real connectedness that people had, and a sense of everyone pushing towards something higher, which was actually a sense of justice at the end of the day. It was a sense of like all this pent up anger after the financial crash and just the general corruption of the financial system. There was almost a transcendent moment, and it breached into mainstream awareness and then kind of fizzled out. And I think we'll keep seeing more and more of those breaches. And I have a suspicion that the only way, or the best way, that we have to come into a sense of coherence with one another in the incredibly complex, globalized, international world we live in, is some sense of a kind of meta religion that is big enough to encapsulate all of that. Now, I think it'll be very strange and weirder than we can imagine. And I have no idea, maybe it's 50 years from now, who knows, maybe it never happens, but that's something I'm fascinated by. I'm fascinated by that potential. And I feel actually a great amount of hope in it, because I think one of our big problems right now is coordination. Is something that Daniel Schmachtenberger, who we've had on the channel a lot, speaks to a lot. It's like, we cannot, firstly, we can't make sense together. First, we can't even agree on what's true or not. That's a big problem. And that's a huge coordination issue. And then even just, we saw it during the pandemic, we kind of muddled our way through, but like global coordination is very choppy. Even within countries, coordination between all the different complex elements and supply chains and government and school, sort of, it's not nothing, it kind of works, but we don't really have a sense of coordination around big problems like climate change, for example. Somewhat, but it could be much better. And so some meta narrative or some higher purpose or transpersonal object or transpersonal sense of meaning, I think, is really important. And I think that's as John Vervaeke as well argues, that's I think what's missing, like the main thing that's missing. And my hope is that at some point it comes back in some form.
Yeah, beautifully said. And this does speak so much to one of the malaises of our time, the desacralization of life and the lack of a space for the transcendent. I think of the words of Abraham Maslow, one of the famous psychologists of the 20th century, who said, without the transcendent, we become sick and nihilistic. And we can see that a lot. And Maslow spoke to, Maslow was so creative, but he recognized that there are not only the ordinary motives we recognize, there are meta motives, higher motives, self-actualization. And finally, towards the end of his life, he suggested self-transcendence was a crucial motive. And he also pointed out that just as there are pathologies when we don't get some of our basic needs met, when we don't get enough food, we starve, when we don't, et cetera, et cetera. But he said there are metapathologies. And when we don't recognize and honor those subtle callings to actualize our potentials, to be what we can, and to realize, recognize something larger than ourselves, then we suffer from metapathologies. And he pointed to metapathologies like cynicism and nihilism and malaise and a sense of just ennui, all of which he pointed out but our culture doesn't recognize, and so they're often misdiagnosed as, as something else. They're not recognized as these symptoms of the lack of something larger to offer our lives to. And I think so I really appreciate your pointing to the need for a bringing the transcendent back into our culture in multiple ways. And you've spoken to it in a variety of ways, the psychedelics, the quest, the religions, etc. So, but it just feels so important and not much spoken about.
Yeah, thank you for that, bringing the metapathologies in. I've never heard of that, Maslow's work on that. That feels, incredibly insightful. That because he was absolutely right. It seems like you're pointing to, like, it really, that is the swing between nihilism and narcissism. I think, as a lot of people have pointed out, we're going through. And there's I noticed there's a strange, there's a kind of necessity to let go of control in that, as well. I think culturally, because I think it will emerge in some sense. It's not like, I'm not sure, this is my guess, is that we're in a different mode of history where previously we had, very powerful, enlightened, tapped in figures like Christ or Buddha, who would kind of hold that space and be like, hark, I've tapped in. And then people would follow that, because there were fewer, this is my guess. I'm really just, I could be wrong about this, but I think if they were to come along now, they'd be on Twitter and everyone would be like, shut up. It's such a multipolar world of many interlapping narratives that I think it's almost like a much more of the emergence of a complex system, somehow this kind of transcendent meta value might emerge from the interactions we're all having. And I have a sense that it will emerge first on the internet, and we won't know what it is probably until like QAnon. I mean, just the level of traction that got, and how kind of divorced from reality it was. I can imagine something hopefully more connected to reality and to essence coming out, and so I almost feel myself sort of watching and waiting. Hopefully I might be doing it for 50 years. God knows what the internet will look like at that point. But I feel myself kind of very curious as to the kind of bubblings of the collective unconscious. Yeah.
Well, there's also a saying in countercultural Judaism that there is no Messiah and you're it. So
that's great.
So it may be up to us.
Yeah.
We can't count on another Jesus or Buddha. If you're a fundamentalist, you can, but other than that, it's maybe up to us, just us nerds or schleps to do what we can. You alluded to something, Ali, which seems incredibly important, which you and Rebel Wisdom have given a lot of time to, which I've learned from a great deal. That is your discussions around what you call the crisis of meaning or sense making. And that does seem, as Daniel Schmachtenberger would say, fundamental, because if we can't come to some consensus about the very nature of life and reality, and even prior to that, how we discern that, then we're in deep trouble. And I'd love to have you speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the knottiest problems that we have. And I actually think sort of upstream from that is the problem of the meaning crisis first and foremost, where it doesn't give us a foundation with which to actually find truth together, or agree on truth together at least. But there's so many different elements to it, and one of them is just a very practical one of the information landscape, as Schmachtenberger calls it, being so a complete overwhelm for all of us. There's just far too much information coming towards us at any given time, and so to try and even just the practicalities of making sense of that, I think, are very difficult. And I think meditation is a really good effective tool for that, because it allows us to observe without reacting. And I think being able to observe without reacting is really an essential skill online. And so those kind of, there's basic capacities like that. And, a lot of people are doing a really great work in looking at cognitive bias. And, we had a Rebel Wisdom event over the weekend, and there was a guy, Narayan Wong, who does a lot of work in the rationalist community. And they're as the name suggests, they're very into kind of reason. It's a very kind of almost stoic style approach. But they, they have even just a very simple method of looking at truth claims and certainties that we have. How certain are we about something, and putting a percentage to it? And immediately that already is quite useful. It's like, well, okay, how certain am I that the earth is round? Well, I'm probably 99.9% certain. It's like, well, how certain am I of the something else a bit more complex? So 60-70%. And it's actually, I find it very easy to find a percentage. It just kind of goes to it. So there's little things like that can kind of bring us out of it. But I think one of the main things that we've looked at a lot in Rebel Wisdom is this understanding that making sense isn't something we just do through thought. In fact, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. It's really an embodied process where we have to be deeply we're doing it with the whole person, and we have to be deeply attuned to as many aspects of ourselves as possible: our emotional reality, our own history and cognitive biases, and our own shadows. We've talked a lot about the necessity of looking at the shadow, so that we can really do our best to actually get away from certainty. and there's a great phrase that I learned from David Trelevin, who's a meditation teacher, which is complexity tolerance. Our ability to tolerate, it speaks to what you were speaking to, Roger, earlier, the kind of perspectival fluidity, and this also, the complexity tolerance is a kind of resilience in not knowing, and the ability to be okay with not being certain, which is something that I think is often, we're not really taught in school, but it feels like the necessary first step to be making sense. And then lastly, it's that I think something we've learned is that we can't just make sense alone. We really have to be making sense with each other. And that's where the work of a lot of the relating practices and the inquiry and the dialogue practices come in, because that's a whole other realm of complexity of, wow, okay, now I have to bring in someone else's worldview and my own, and hold simultaneously my own emotional reality and theirs, and know where am I projecting, where they may be overstepping, and it's actually they've kind of taken that premise too far. And we do it a lot naturally, but all of these things factor into it. So I guess it's not a new thing. It's something I guess we've been doing forever as human beings. It's just we're facing new levels of challenge with it, and I think we also need to be experimenting with what practices help us do it.
And you're pointing to some very important principles there, Ali. First, you're acknowledging, for example, the complexity challenge, that we do face new levels of complexity far beyond what we're traditionally exposed to. And what you didn't mention there, but I'm sure you're very aware of, is that the capacity for handling levels of complexity is a developmental process. And there are significant maps now. So we're talking about how we how we can foster maturity in a way. There's so much we could talk about here, Ali, and I personally would love to. So I want to extract a promise from you to have another conversation another time. But
I would love to. Yeah, I really would. I feel like we only scratched the surface, and there was a lot I wanted to ask both of you as well. So I'm very open to that. Yeah, guaranteed.
Would you like just to say, just take as long as you have or want to? We've talked about a lot of the challenges we face at this time, but what gives you hope?
What a lovely question. I think what gives me hope is, yeah, what comes for me is this line that Terence McKenna used to say, and I'm sure many other people have said it in different ways, but that humanity is at its best when it's under pressure. And Doshin Roshi, who we've had on Rebel Wisdom a few times, I think his teacher used to say, "When do we change? When we have to." And I think that's certainly been my experience in life. I think there is a kind of I think there's a really deep truth to that. And so I think we are under pressure and we are facing multiple complex challenges all at the same time. But what really gives me hope is that I think we step into a new version of ourselves and a new version of our kind of collective selves when we're faced with that kind of pressure. So that's kind of what gives me hope.
Wonderful. Well, it's just been a sheer delight and a stimulus that feels like there have been light bulbs going off all over the places. You've said you come up with various novel ideas, and they've sparked ideas in me, and so I'm very grateful. And I just want to acknowledge what a contribution you've made. You said you're only 34. God, what did I? You've done so much and contributed so much and touched so many people. Just just want to acknowledge you and thank you for all you're doing. And for those people who'd like to have more of Ali, he, of course, Rebel Wisdom is one of his major platforms, and I recommend his articles on Medium. And I don't know your website off heart, but I will find it and point our listeners to it. Ali, thank you so much for being available and doing this dialogue.
Yeah, and thank you both too. And then also, like, I owe much of my insight to integral theory and to your work as well, Roger. And I really appreciate that the opportunity to chat. I really would like to do it again because I think there's so much more we could talk about. And great. So thank you so much, and see you again soon.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I feel like I found a new brother.
Likewise. Yeah, and let's certainly catch up. I'd love to hear about your experience in back in the psychedelic realm. So,
yes, indeed.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Thank you.
You too. Bye.